Tashkent, capital of Uzbekistan. Once this was part of the Soviet Union, now its government is helping us in the war against terrorism. There's a degree of paranoia about working here that's really hard to capture on tape. But when it became independent, Uzbekistan inherited all the Soviet technology for spying on its own citizens, the secret police, the networks of informers. And yet the West is buying its friendship. The regime gets millions of dollars in aid. We get to use its bases for the war in neighbouring Afghanistan. But just who is our new best friend? Saturday night in downtown Tashkent, I was on my way to a pop concert. The government are former communists, the people are Muslim, the pop stars are homegrown. This is Satora, Uzbekistan's top girl group. And what's funny about Satora, the band, is that they're so enormous, they've even been co-opted by the government into the war against terrorism. Their hit video is a song about a soldier who dies fighting terrorists. The regime here says it's battling its own extremists. That's one of the reasons they've become our friends. In 1999, terrorist bombs killed 16 people in Tashkent. It triggered a crackdown. We're on our way to the trial of two members of a banned Islamic organisation, well, alleged members. The government often puts on trial those people who it says are trying to overthrow the state. But it's also drawn a lot of criticism for the way those trials are conducted. So it's going to be interesting to see just what goes on in this one. The men were accused of belonging to Hizb ut-Tahrir. It does want an Islamic government, but it doesn't support terrorism. Their defence lawyer was late, but the trial began anyway. President Karimov had never been very keen on opposition. The bombs in Tashkent were his cue for suppressing it entirely. The cross-examination began.
The
younger one said he went to the Hizb ut-Tahrir meetings were held in the attic of his apartment building, between the top flat and the roof. They met up there. And the older one was given 56 pamphlets to distribute, of which he distributed 10 on a bus. I mean, these guys are facing possibly 18 years in prison each. I mean, if they get given the maximum, 18 years. That's a bloody long time for whatever they've done. Especially if it's just distributing a few pamphlets. The two men are still waiting for the verdict. We are on our way to an Uzbek prison, and in the front seat of the car is a minder from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, who I'm strongly hoping doesn't speak English. Uzbek prisons are notorious for their awful conditions, for brutal treatment of prisoners, and even for deaths that happen while the prisoners are in custody. And even human rights groups have a really difficult time getting inside them. So I'm astonished that we're being allowed in, frankly. The Ministry of Internal Affairs had chosen to let me visit Zangyote High Security Prison. There are at least 7,000 people in prison in Uzbekistan for what the government calls religious crimes. Human rights groups say many of them have been tortured and sexually abused into giving confessions. Three prisoners were lined up for me to meet: Avaz, Fakhruddin and Kazim. A man from the Ministry of Internal Affairs took down their names. And I think these guys are scared, and I think they're reminding them, that they have a lot of power over them. They'd been sentenced for going to religious meetings and handing out leaflets. Does he think 12 years is too long for his crime? Doesn't he think it's a very long sentence? He told me it wasn't. But then the prison governor was listening. Kazim was serving 16 years. What did he think? He says he deserves his sentence because of the nature of his crime, but he's really hoping the president will be merciful to him and give him, include him in his next amnesty, and in which case Kazim will work for the prosperity of the countries when he's released. They made the prison sound like a boarding school. I just was asking Kazim what the food was like in prison, and rather unsurprisingly, he said it's delicious and there's plenty of it. The Uzbek government had wanted me to see that not only is it locking up our common enemies, but it's doing it humanely. I wasn't convinced. Anytime they seemed to be straying onto anything remotely dangerous, the KGB guy, the Ministry of Internal Affairs guy, who was sitting there the whole time, intervened. The only time that any of them got animated was when they were talking about the amnesties, and that I believe they sincerely want. Everything else I thought was a facade, frankly. I had a rendezvous to arrange. I was trying to meet someone who wouldn't be afraid to tell me the truth. Хорошо, увидимся тогда. Okay, thank you. Пока. That was someone I was told to call before I left the UK, but they said the situation here being what it is, you have to be a bit careful what you say on the phone, so I was given a code word to say to this guy. And also I was told not to call from the hotel in case the phone was bugged, so I thought I'd do it from here. Now I just have to get a car over to the other side of the city to see this bloke. The man I was going to see is Uzbekistan's leading human rights activist. Since he was attacked in his flat, he's careful who he opens the door to.
Okay, хорошо. Здравствуйте.
Mikhail Ardzinov has escaped prison so far because he's well known abroad. I asked if Uzbekistan would use the alliance with America to increase repression. He said I'd come to the right man. He'd just published the definitive work on the subject. He's in a 10-page pamphlet in Uzbek, Russian and English on human rights in Uzbekistan, which he published for the 10-year anniversary of his party. And this is a little grim little joke.
Not human rights and democracy in Uzbekistan, no.
Because there are no human rights in Uzbekistan. And so it's blank, and on page 10 it says, to be continued. And which has got to be that's black humor, I think.
Наши власти хотят использовать вот эту ситуацию, всех тоже репрессировать, как будто они тоже террористы. Это опасно.
He's saying what the danger is, the government is using the excuse of a war against terrorism to repress any of its opponents, human rights figures, opposition politicians, anyone who criticises the regime, that they'll be branded as terrorists and possibly put in prison, and that's the great danger of the situation the country's in now. It seems so simple initially. Uzbekistan's fighting a war on terrorism, the US is fighting a war on terrorism, so now they're best chums and the US gets to use air bases in Uzbekistan. And then we meet someone like Mikhail Ardzinov, who says it's not a war on terrorism at all that's going on here. The government is a bunch of unreconstructed communists, he says, who are desperate to hang on to power and who are using the threat of terrorism, the threat of fundamentalist Islam as an excuse for their repressive measures. Mr. Ardzinov told me there was someone else I should track down. He gave me an address. An old Soviet lift took me to the 9th floor of an apartment block. I knew Mahbuba Kasimova had recently got out of prison. She'd been sentenced to 5 years for harbouring an extremist. 12. She's been a human rights activist for 12 years, so both under communism and now under an independent Uzbekistan. Mahmouda was in prison here for a year and a half, and she credits her release to the fact that she got so many letters through Amnesty, through international human rights organisations, and these are the letters she got, something like 6,000 of them altogether. They've just brought them all into the room. Dear Makhtuba, my name is Amy Rayner and I live in Petswood. I go to Bullerswood School and I'm in Year 9. My favourite subject at school is maths and I hate geography. Hope you get out soon. Love from Amy Rayner. As we read the letters, she told me her real crime was publicising cases where prisoners didn't get a fair trial. That was why the government locked her up. Her own trial, she said, had lasted half an hour and there'd been no lawyer there. She says if she hadn't got these letters and if she hadn't had the support of international organisations, she'd probably still be in prison. Mahbouba gave me the address of a family whose son died in prison just a few days ago. She said he died of a beating he got in prison. So we're going to go to his family and see if they'll agree to talk to us. I went in without the camera. I'd been in Uzbekistan long enough to know they would be scared. We oppose terrorism to protect our liberty, but here the fight seems to end up with people terrified or dead. They were afraid to talk to us and they won't let us in. I waited there and I spoke to some of the male members of the family. And they seemed very upset, but they were very, very guarded about what they'd say to me. And they said, you know, he died of liver complications in prison. So I asked them, I said, was he mistreated in prison? And they said, no, he wasn't. And then I said, well, was he a religious prisoner? And they said, yeah, he was. But they were very polite, but they were clearly afraid to be open with me. These photos were taken by Human Rights Watch. Furkhat Usmanov was the son of a well-known Muslim preacher. He went into prison healthy and came out like this. Officially, he died of heart failure, but his injuries tell another story. It's almost impossible to know what to believe in this country. I went to the Department of Religious Affairs to talk to the minister. Law-abiding people had nothing to fear, Mr. Minivarov insisted. They could worship however they wanted. What President Karimov wouldn't tolerate was mixing religion and politics. There have been many allegations of torture in Uzbekistan by Human Rights Watch, the State Department, other organisations. Electric shocks, asphyxiation, even sexual abuse, particularly of people who have been detained as religious prisoners. Is there a role for torture in the war on terrorism? He said there wasn't, and he and his ministry had never received details of such allegations. We're heading east into the Fergana Valley, as this is the part of Uzbekistan juts into Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And this is considered to be the tinderbox of Central Asia. This is the part of the country that the government is most suspicious of and is trying hardest of all to control. Radical Islam began to flourish here as communism fell apart. I felt as though we were entering an occupied country. They're very touchy about the security on this road. There are 10 to 15 of these checkpoints, and the last one, one of the guards saw us filming and took both of our cameras and walked off to his chief. We had to show some of the stuff we'd shot, and luckily there were a few pretty sunsets that we could show them and explain that we were really interested in the scenery. My destination was the town of Namangan. 10 years ago to the day, there was an extraordinary demonstration here, and it was secretly filmed by members of the secret police, and I've managed to get my hands on a videotape of what actually took place. The secret video shows thousands of people gathering in the main square. One of them was Nosir Zokir, then a local opposition politician. People streamed into the square from all sides, he said, to shout questions at President Karimov, who was campaigning to keep his job in the first elections since communism. When the president tried to speak, he was heckled. Eventually, a popular local radical took the microphone from him and asked for the crowd to be silent. They weren't. Karimov was humiliated and had to sit fuming while the local man spoke scornfully about his government. He says we had a registered opposition, we had independent newspapers appearing, everything was free, there was freedom. And they thought that what was going on here, they thought this is democracy. It didn't last. The government started shutting mosques. Because the point is that there are empty rooms like this across the Fergana Valley that used to be mosques. There were, in the Namangan area, 1,040, I think, sprang up between 1989 and 1991. Now there's something like 200 of them left. The rest have been closed. The Islamic opposition leaders fled to neighbouring countries like Afghanistan. The young man who'd humiliated Karimov ended up with Osama bin Laden. Just over a year ago, Uzbek terrorists crossed from Tajikistan into this area. After a month of heavy fighting, they were routed. We headed for the town of Chartak. What we've heard about this town is that in February 1999, 17 of its young boys crossed the border into Tajikistan to join the terrorists. I went to the market where they'd been recruited. Were the boys the first wave of a revolution, or angry misfits? I got the feeling that whatever terrorists there were for the time being either out of the country or locked up. We've been trying to talk to people about the boys who disappeared, and they're very, very reluctant to speak to us. Because after all, this is a country where you can get 15 years in prison for handing out Hizb ut-Tahrir leaflets. I was told to speak to these women. They said there was no longer any terrorism, just repression. Their husbands and sons were in jail, simply because one had worked in a mosque. Last year, this is astonishing really, her son came out of the army from doing his military service, so he was 20, and he was then arrested and told that when you were 10 years old, you were disseminating fundamentalist Islam, and for that reason he's been put in prison and given 4 years for a crime that he seems to have committed when he was 10. She says she's absolutely fed up. She says, give me an automatic weapon, give me a Kalashnikov, and I'll go against the government myself. You could say that our new friend President Karimov is winning the war against terrorism. But his tactics are like a primitive cancer treatment that kills as much as it cures. Back in Tashkent, that feeling would grow stronger. I've come here to meet a woman who's travelled 1,000 kilometres to try and get justice for her husband and sons. 2 of her sons have been sentenced to death for being terrorists. And she says they're innocent and they didn't get a fair trial. And she's staying in Tashkent with friends, but her friends are too afraid for us to film in their apartment, so we've had to come somewhere else to meet her. Darman Sultanova has come to Tashkent to find out if her sons are still alive. They were arrested 3 years ago and sentenced to be shot. She says everything that happened, she says it was all illegal. It was an illegal trial, it was everything that went on was illegal, and there are no laws in Uzbekistan. And she also said that when she saw her sons at the trial, they'd been tortured and she had difficulty recognising them, and even their voices had changed. She told us that even under torture, her sons had refused to confess, so the police tried one last ploy. She says that she was taken down to the police station and they made her take her clothes off, and she was begging them not to make her undress. But they forced her. There were 4 people came in and they took her clothes off, and then she was put into a room naked, and her sons and other men were brought in. She was humiliated and abused by the police officers. One son then confessed after the police threatened to put his young wife through the same ordeal and then rape her. This is the death sentence against her sons. Against one of her sons. Darman was adamant that we shouldn't film her out on the streets. She had business down at the registry of births, deaths, and marriages. It's absolutely chilling, but Darman has to come here every 2 or 3 months in order to find out whether the death sentence on her sons has been carried out. And this is the only way she has of knowing whether they're dead or alive. In Uzbek, this place is called the House of Happiness. She told me her sons were still alive, this time. She said she'd give anything to change places with them. She showed me photographs of her grandchildren. She wonders whether they'll ever see their fathers again. Collateral damage in the war against terrorism.